In a previous conversation that I had with you, I told you that we have 85 to 90 forms of dementia. And so right now what I thought we'd talk about is the more prevalent forms of dementia. I think this is essential for you to be aware of. So you are considering behaviors and characteristics of yourself or your loved one, and then you can speak more in a more informed way with your doctor. So the most prevalent forms of dementia include vascular dementia, Parkinson's disease, dementia with Lewy bodies, Huntington's disease, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, that's CTE, frontal temporal lobe dementia, normal pressure hydrocephalus, Korsakoff syndrome, Alzheimer's disease, and early onset Alzheimer's. So let's delve into each one of those now. Vascular dementia. This is most commonly the result of blockage to the supply of blood to the brain. Strokes take place when the supply of blood carrying the oxygen to the brain is suddenly cut off. However, not all people with strokes will develop vascular dementia. Vascular dementia can also develop from oxygen deprivation to the brain as a result of a massive heart attack, for example. Clinically, such patients can look very similar to patients with Alzheimer's disease. And when this occurs, the two diseases are very difficult to distinguish from one another. However, some of the clinical symptoms and brain imaging findings will suggest that vascular dementia is playing a role in, if not completely explaining, the patient's cognitive impairment. So this condition is not necessarily a single disease. It's a group of symptoms relating to different vascular mechanisms. I was really surprised to learn that vascular dementia can be preventable. And that's why it's important to have early detection, and an accurate diagnosis is very, very important. Unlike Alzheimer's, people with vascular dementia often maintain their personalities and their normal levels of emotional responsiveness until the last stages of the disease. I want to tell you a story about a very dear friend of mine who did have vascular dementia from a massive heart attack. He was phenomenal. He knew what was going on all the time. He covered all the news. He read news magazines. He watched the news. He could tell you, have conversations with you about a wide range of issues. It was fascinating to enjoy him. And then he would look at his wife and he'd say, "Listen, I need to get going now because my mother will be waiting for me and it's getting late." And I want to tell you that because it was hard for a lot of people to understand just the complexities that his wife was dealing with. There were some of the more simple things that he just couldn't retain, and some of what we thought were pretty complex that he could. He had vascular dementia, and he really never developed Alzheimer's disease. Now let's talk about Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's is a chronic, progressive movement disorder, meaning that symptoms continue and worsen over time. The primary motor signs of Parkinson's disease include the following things: tremors of the hands, the arms, legs, jaws, and face; bradykinesia, or the slowness of moving; rigidity or stiffness of the limbs and the trunk; and postural instability, or impaired balance and coordination. If someone lives long enough with Parkinson's disease, it's very likely that they will also develop cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's disease. This next form of dementia with Lewy bodies disease is becoming more prevalent. It can become confused with Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. The symptoms of this overlap in a lot of ways with Alzheimer's, and it may include memory impairment, poor judgment, and confusion. However, DLBD, as we call it, typically includes visual hallucinations, Parkinsonian symptoms such as shuffling gait, flexed posture, and day-to-day fluctuations in the severity of the symptoms. It's also a very aggressive disease. Huntington's disease. So Huntington's disease is a fatal genetic disorder, and it causes the progressive breakdown of nerve cells in the brain. It deteriorates a person's physical and mental abilities during the prime time of their life, and we have, of course, no cure. It's known as the quintessential family disease because every child of a parent with Huntington's disease has a 50-50 chance of carrying that faulty gene. And Huntington's disease usually strikes you, as we said, in the prime of life. So in your early 40s is not uncommon, and life expectancy is not great. This next one is called dementia pugilistica. Not something you say quickly. This form of dementia is making headlines today because of the NFL players. Pugilistica is actually more commonly known, or also known as, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. We're going to call it CTE for short, and CTE is the term you're going to hear a lot in the news. This is the direct result of head traumas that football players endure during the games. It affects the individuals through poor coordination, slurry speech, significant mood swings, and aggressive behavior. There's a reason that we hear a lot about this today, and there's concern about our children playing football at such young ages. You know, it's all these concussions, the impact to the brain. It takes its toll. So something to be aware of with your grandchildren, your nieces and nephews, your adult children, if they've played football or they've had traumatic brain injury. You might see characteristics that present themselves. Now, I'm not telling you this to alarm you. I'm telling you this to inform you. As I've often said, it's what we don't know that costs us time, energy, money, and pain. So that's why I'm so keen on knowledge. Now let's talk about frontotemporal dementia. Gosh, this is another one that we are definitely seeing more often. And it causes a group of brain disorders. And they share clinical features. FTD is also commonly referred to as frontal temporal dementia, frontal temporal lobe dementia, or Pick's disease. And FTD has a distinction from other forms of dementias in two very important ways. The hallmark of FTD is a gradual progressive decline of behavior and/or language, with memory usually relatively preserved for a while. And as this disease progresses, it becomes increasingly difficult for people to plan or organize activities. They behave inappropriately in social settings and work settings, and in their interaction with others and caring for themselves. And they also have an increased dependency on their caregiver. The onset of FTD often occurs in a person in their 50s and 60s, and roughly 60% of those cases do occur in people between the ages of 45 and 64. I've actually been quite surprised and saddened by the number of families that I've worked with in just the last 2 years who have been diagnosed with FTD or FTLD. This is a very aggressive form of dementia, and life expectancy is usually under 5 years from the time of the diagnosis. Normal pressure hydrocephalus. Now, normal pressure hydrocephalus is a form of dementia, but it can be treatable if it's caught early enough. This disorder is caused by excessive fluid in the brain, and it causes thinking and reasoning problems, difficulty walking, loss of bladder control. It's actually estimated that there are more than 700,000 Americans who have NPH, and that less than 20% of them receive an appropriate diagnosis. This is really important. This is another case where I've met a number of families where, in some cases, they were incorrectly diagnosed with Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia when in fact it was NPH. And because it wasn't properly diagnosed early enough, it wasn't treatable. And I've met people who fortunately were properly diagnosed. They had shunts implanted in their brain, the fluids are drained, and they're living a great life. So, a proper, appropriate diagnostic testing is so crucial. I don't want to see a misdiagnosis of this. And this is another reason I talk about the importance of being an advocate for your loved one and for yourself. You need to know exactly, have we absolutely covered every possibility, and are we really treating the right form of dementia? Let me emphasize again that NPH is one of the few causes of dementia that can be controlled or reversed with treatment. Korsakoff syndrome. Now, this is a chronic memory disorder, and it's caused by severe deficiency in theanine, which is vitamin B1. Korsakoff syndrome is most commonly caused by alcohol misuse, but can also be associated with AIDS, chronic infections, poor nutrition, and certain other conditions. Something we just really need to be aware of. We do unfortunately have a high level of alcohol abuse in this country. And so it's important to be aware of the repercussions. Now let's talk about Alzheimer's. This causes problems with memory, thinking, behaviors for sure. Symptoms usually develop very slowly, and they get worse over time, to the point that they become severe enough that they really start interfering with your daily life. In fact, Alzheimer's disease is in a development stage for easily 10 to 15 years before we become really aware of the symptoms. Alzheimer's is not a normal part of aging. I want to reinforce that. It is not a normal part of aging. There are two types of Alzheimer's. There's late life Alzheimer's, which is what we're more used to seeing with people in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. But there's another type of Alzheimer's, and it's called early onset Alzheimer's. Earlier onset, this is especially tragic because it affects people who are younger than 65. And a good percentage of those people can develop it in their 40s and 50s. Now, with early onset Alzheimer's, we have two types. We have what's called common Alzheimer's, and that's going to also start, as I said, in the 50s and 60s, but it's going to progress along the lines of the more traditional forms of Alzheimer's. And then we have genetic Alzheimer's disease, and this form is extremely rare. Very few people really have the gene that directly contribute to Alzheimer's disease. And if they do, and it's activated, and that's a key word, and it's activated, they may start showing signs of Alzheimer's in their 30s, 40s, or 50s. And in those cases, it's very, very aggressive, meaning they will live an extremely short time. Let me introduce you to another term that you're going to hear bandied about in the doctor's office. It's called mild cognitive impairment, MCI for short. You know, as we get older, our brain changes, just like the rest of our body. And many people, well, we start to notice increased forgetfulness as we get older. And it takes us a little bit longer to remember something and have a word recall, or what was that person's name? Well, sometimes we get so concerned about this, and we talk to the doctor and we say we have this problem, and they say, oh, it's just natural, it's aging. Or they may say to you, well, this might be the beginning of mild cognitive impairment. Characteristics around mild cognitive impairment are changes that aren't so severe that they really interfere with your day-to-day life. They may include, You can continue to live alone, function pretty well. You have little glitches, but they're not life-altering yet. And these symptoms of mild cognitive impairment, they could remain stable for years. They may never progress to Alzheimer's disease or any other form of dementia, or in time, they can progress to Alzheimer's. It's kind of a fuzzy territory, and so I want you to be aware of mild cognitive impairment. I want you to be an informed advocate for yourself and your family member. As I said, it's a symptom, it's a characteristic. It does not mean that you have Alzheimer's. It is not even officially a form of dementia, but it is a term that you will hear a lot, and I felt it was important to include it in this overview of the more prevalent forms of dementia that you will hear about, need to know about, and have conversations with your doctor about.